Come in. Settle down. The archives are quiet tonight, aren't they? It's the silence of stories waiting to be told. Most people walk through history as if it's a well-lit museum, all the exhibits neatly labeled and explained. But I spend my time in the basement, down here in the dust, where the truth is often stranger, messier, and far more entertaining than anything they show you upstairs. We're about to open a file on the great deceptions, the magnificent lies, the hoaxes so audacious, so brilliantly executed, they broke free from their creators and took on a life of their own, shaking the world to its very core. These are the stories that prove reality is the most imaginative author of all. If you like stories in this format, support this cycle with a like, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. It will inspire us to open new archives. Story number 1. The night America believed the Martians had landed. Imagine the date, October 30th, 1938. The night before Halloween. There's a chill in the air across America. The Great Depression still has its cold grip on the nation, and the whispers of war from across the ocean in Europe are growing louder. Families huddle around their radios, these big, warm wooden boxes that glow in the dark. It's their connection to the world, their escape. Tonight, most are tuned into a popular comedy show, a little lighthearted fun before the work week begins. But some, maybe by accident, maybe out of curiosity, turn the dial. And they land on the CBS radio network. They're met with the soothing sounds of ballroom music from a hotel in New York City. Ordinary. Safe. Then the music stops, suddenly. An announcer breaks in, his voice tight with urgency. He apologizes for the interruption. There's a news bulletin. An astronomer has just observed several explosions on the surface of the planet Mars. A pause. The music returns, but it feels different now. Tense. A few minutes later, another interruption. This time, the news is more detailed. A strange object, believed to be a meteorite, has crashed on a farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. A reporter is on his way to the scene. You can almost feel the entire country lean a little closer to their radios. A meteorite? How curious. This wasn't a news broadcast, not really. It was a radio play. The work of a 23-year-old prodigy, a theatrical genius named Orson Welles. He was adapting H.G. Wells's classic novel, The War of the Worlds, for his show, The Mercury Theater on the Air. And he decided to stage it not as a story, but as a series of live, breaking news reports. A little Halloween prank. What could go wrong? Everything. The broadcast continued. The on-the-scene reporter arrives, his voice crackling with static and fear. He describes a massive metal cylinder, a hissing sound. The top begins to unscrew. You can hear the grinding metal through the radio. It's a sound effect, of course, but who would know that? The crowd in the background gasps. Something is emerging. The reporter's voice trembles as he describes a creature with glistening skin and tentacles, firing a heat ray that incinerates everything in its path. Then, screaming. Silence. The line goes dead. And America lost its mind. Think about it. In 1938, the radio was the absolute truth. If a voice from a box said something was happening, it was happening. There was no internet to check, no 24-hour news channel to flip to. There was only that one terrified voice. And then another. And another. Wells's production was masterful. He had actors playing military officials, scientists, and government secretaries, all confirming the horrifying reality. The Martians were real. They were here. And they were winning. Panic erupted. People flooded police stations with calls. Families grabbed shotguns and barricaded themselves in their basements. Others threw their belongings in their cars and fled into the night, clogging the highways. In one town, the power went out at the exact moment of the fictional gas attack, plunging the residents into darkness and absolute certainty that their doom had arrived. Honestly, can you blame them? It sounded so real, so utterly, terrifyingly real. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was an invasion. Back in the studio, Orson Welles and his actors were completely unaware of the chaos they had unleashed. They were just performing a play. It was only when police stormed the CBS building that they realized their little prank had spiraled into national hysteria. At the end of the show, Welles broke character to remind everyone it was just a story, a Halloween trick. But for hundreds of thousands of people, it was too late. The damage was done. The next day, there was outrage. Lawsuits were threatened. Newspapers condemned Welles for his irresponsibility. But something else happened too. A young man, a boy genius, had single-handedly exposed the incredible power and danger of the new medium of mass communication. He showed how easily the line between fact and fiction could be blurred with just a convincing voice and a few sound effects. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? How a single story, told well enough, can become reality. This hoax played with our fears of the unknown, of what might be lurking in the dark sky above. But some of the greatest deceptions in history didn't come from the sky. They came from the ground beneath our feet, from the very foundations of science itself. They didn't just trick our ears for one night. They fooled our minds for decades. Story number 2. The skull that made fools of the world's greatest minds. Picture the scene. It's England. The year is 1912. The air is thick with coal smoke and a kind of unshakable confidence. The British Empire is at its peak, and London is the center of the world. Science, especially, is booming. Charles Darwin's ideas have set the world on fire, and the greatest minds in the country are locked in a frantic race. A race to find the missing link, the fossil that would connect apes to humanity. The Germans had found their Neanderthal. The French had the Cro-Magnon. Britain, the cradle of modern science, had nothing. A national embarrassment, really. Enter Charles Dawson, a country lawyer, an amateur archaeologist, a man with a passion for fossils and a burning desire for recognition from the scientific elite in London. For years, he'd been digging in a gravel pit in a place called Piltdown, and then, one day, he found it. Or so he said. He presented his findings to the Geological Society of London. Fragments of a skull. A very human-like skull, but incredibly thick, suggesting great age. And then, the jawbone. It was brutish, ape-like. But here was the kicker. The teeth, the molars, were ground down flat. Not like an ape's, but like a human's, from chewing side to side. It was perfect, almost too perfect. The skull of a man, the jaw of an ape. The missing link, the first Englishman. They named him Eoanthropus dawsoni, Dawson's Dawn Man. Britain went wild. Finally, they had their ancestor, and he was exactly what they wanted him to be. He had a large, intelligent brain, you see. The jaw was primitive, sure, but the brain was advanced. This proved, to their satisfaction, that humanity's defining feature, our intellect, had evolved first. It was a very British, very civilized sort of ancestor. Dawson became a national hero. The Piltdown Man, as he was nicknamed, became the star exhibit at the Natural History Museum. He was the foundation upon which the entire theory of human evolution was built for the next 4 decades. But there were whispers, doubts. Other fossils were being discovered around the world, in Africa and Asia, and they told a different story. A story where the jaw evolved first and the brain came later. But whenever a new fossil contradicted the Piltdown Man, it was the new fossil that was dismissed. The Piltdown Man was fact. It was truth. How could so many great minds be wrong? They were. Utterly and completely wrong. The years rolled by. World wars came and went, and science moved on. By the 1950s, new technologies had emerged, new ways of seeing the past. A team of scientists decided to re-examine the Piltdown fragments using a new fluorine absorption test, which could determine the relative age of bones from the same site. The result was a bombshell. The skull and the jaw had wildly different amounts of fluorine. They weren't from the same time period at all. They weren't even from the same creature. The house of cards collapsed. They looked closer, with microscopes this time. The teeth hadn't been worn down by chewing. They had been deliberately filed down with a metal tool, Scratches were still visible. And the bones, they hadn't been fossilized naturally. They had been artificially stained with an iron solution and potassium bichromate to make them look ancient. The Piltdown Man was a fraud, a crude, almost insulting fake. The skull was human, maybe 500 years old. The jaw belonged to a modern orangutan. Someone had taken a human skull, an ape's jaw, filed the teeth, stained the bones, and planted them in a gravel pit for Charles Dawson to find. The deception held the scientific world captive for 41 years. Think about that. It sent researchers down a dead-end road for 2 generations. Why? Because it told them exactly what they wanted to hear. It confirmed their biases about their own national and intellectual superiority. They weren't tricked by the evidence. They were tricked by their own pride. It just goes to show you that even the most brilliant people can be fooled if they want to believe something badly enough. The lie about the Piltdown Man was built on bones and chemicals, something tangible. But the next deception we're going to uncover is built on something far more ethereal, something you can't see or touch. It began not in a gravel pit, but in a dark little house, with a sound as simple as a knock on wood. Story number 3. The Girls Who Made the Dead Speak by Cracking Their Toes. Let's go to the year 1848. We're in a small, unremarkable house in Hydesville, New York. A new family has just moved in, the Fox family. And it's a noisy house. Creaks, groans, and at night, a strange rhythmic knocking sound. Raps that seem to come from inside the very walls. Most people would have been terrified. They would have called a priest or, more likely, just moved out. But the 2 youngest daughters of the family, Margaretta and Kate, who were just teenagers, did something different. They weren't scared. They were curious. One night, as the knocking started, little Kate, the youngest, threw out a challenge into the darkness. "Here, Mr. Splitfoot," she joked, "do as I do." She clapped her hands. A series of knocks answered her, matching her claps perfectly. Silence. Then, a shiver of something new in the room. Not fear, a possibility. Margaretta then asked the invisible presence to count to 10. 10 distinct knocks echoed through the little bedroom. They asked at the ages of their parents. The correct number of knocks answered each time. They had done it. They had started a conversation. And in that moment, a simple prank between 2 bored sisters spun out of their control and ignited a global spiritual fire. The story they concocted was that the knocks were from the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered in the house and buried in the cellar. It was a fantastic story, a terrifying story, and the whole town wanted to hear it. People flocked to the tiny Fox house to witness the miracle. They would ask questions, and the spirit would answer with 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. It was real. It had to be. How else could you explain it? The girls, pushed by their ambitious older sister Leah, became a sensation. They went on tour. They held seances in grand parlors and packed theaters in New York City. The rich and the famous, the brilliant and the bereaved, all came to sit in a dark room with 2 farm girls from upstate New York, just to hear those mysterious raps. Horace Greeley, the famous newspaper editor, became a believer. James Fenimore Cooper, the novelist, was fascinated. The movement exploded. They called it spiritualism. Suddenly, everyone could talk to the dead. All you needed was a medium, a dark room, and a willingness to believe. And people were desperate to believe. The 19th century was a brutal time. Life was short. Everyone had lost someone. A child, a spouse, a parent. The Fox sisters weren't just offering a show, they were offering a cure for grief. And the secret? The simple, almost laughable trick behind it all? It was their toes. The girls had discovered they could produce a loud, sharp rap by cracking the joints in their toes and ankles. In a quiet room, with the tension high, the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They practiced until they were masters, able to do it without moving a muscle, fooling investigating committees of scientists and doctors who searched them for hidden devices. No one ever thought to make them take off their shoes. It was so simple, so childish, it was genius. But the lie was a heavy burden. The girls grew into women, trapped in the spiritual cage they had built. They were celebrities, yes, but they were also prisoners of Mr. Splitfoot. They drank heavily. Their lives became a mess of public performances and private misery. Then, 40 years after that first night in Hydesville, it all fell apart. In 1888, a bitter and broke Margaretta Fox rented the New York Academy of Music. She walked onto the stage in front of a huge crowd of reporters and believers, and she confessed everything. She told the world it had all been a lie, a prank that went too far. To prove it, she took off her shoe, placed her foot on a small wooden stool, and in the dead silence of the massive hall, a series of loud, hollow raps echoed through the room. The sound that had started a religion. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? The founder confesses, the movement collapses. But you'd be wrong. By then, the lie was too big. It didn't belong to the Fox sisters anymore. It belonged to the millions who needed it to be true. The spiritualist movement publicly denounced Margaretta, claiming she'd been bribed by skeptics. They kept on believing. The lie had become a faith, and faith is much harder to kill than a simple fact. It's a strange human flaw, isn't it? When a comforting lie and a harsh truth are put side by side, we so often choose the lie. The Fox sisters' deception was built on hope, but the next one we'll look at was built on something far more tangible, far more universal. It wasn't about getting a message from heaven. It was about getting rich right here on Earth. And the man behind it was so good at it, his very name became the definition of the scam. Story number 4. The charming man who built an empire of air. The year is 1920. The Great War is over. The world is trying to forget, to celebrate, to get rich. And in Boston, Massachusetts, there is a palpable buzz of energy. The roaring 20s have just begun. Anything feels possible. And in the middle of it all is a small, dapper man named Charles Ponzi, an Italian immigrant, barely over 5 feet tall, always smiling, with a confidence that could charm a snake out of its skin. And he has a secret, a way to make money, a lot of money. And honestly, his idea sounded brilliant. It really did. It was all about something called international reply coupons. Think of them like vouchers for postage stamps that could be bought in one country and exchanged for stamps in another. Because of the wild currency fluctuations after the war, Ponzi noticed a loophole. A coupon bought for, say, $1 in Spain could be exchanged for stamps worth $1.50 in the United States. You could then sell the stamps for cash. It was arbitrage, a simple, legal way to make a profit. This is the key to all great financial hoaxes. They start with a kernel of truth, a story that makes just enough sense. Ponzi started small. He convinced a few friends to invest. And then he did something remarkable. He paid them exactly what he promised. He told them they would make a 50% profit in just 45 days. A 50% return. Think about that. While banks were offering maybe 5% a year, it was an insane, unbelievable promise. And he kept it. Word spread like wildfire. Why work for a living when you could just give your money to Mr. Ponzi? Soon, there were lines down the block outside his small office. Thousands of people. Factory workers, seamstresses, policemen, even bankers. They came with their life savings, stuffing wads of cash into his hands. They didn't even care about the coupons anymore. They just knew that if you gave Ponzi money, you got more money back. He was a financial magician, a hero of the working class. And this is the genius of the scam, the cruel, beautiful simplicity of it. He wasn't investing the money. Why bother with the hassle of buying and selling millions of postal coupons? It was practically impossible to do on that scale anyway. No, he was doing something much simpler. He was using the money from new investors to pay off the early ones. That's it. That was the whole secret. As long as more money was coming in than was going out, the illusion of success was perfect. Ponzi became a king. He bought a mansion with 26 rooms, a custom-built limousine, and wore diamond stick pins. He was living proof that the dream was real. He wasn't just selling a return on investment, he was selling a fantasy. The fantasy that a little guy could get one over on the system. But an empire built on air cannot last. It needs a constant, ever-increasing flow of new money to survive. The moment that flow slows down, the whole thing implodes. A financial journalist at the Boston Post started asking questions. Difficult questions. Like, for Ponzi's company to be profitable, there would need to be 160 million international reply coupons in circulation. The actual number was closer to 27,000. The numbers didn't add up. The newspaper articles started a panic. People wanted their money back, all at once. A run on Ponzi's bank. For a while, he held them off, paying out with a smile. But the floodgates had opened. In August of 1920, the whole scheme collapsed. It was revealed that Ponzi was millions of dollars in debt. The money was gone. Spent. Vanished into the pockets of the early investors and Ponzi's own lavish lifestyle. Thousands of people lost everything. Their homes, their savings, their dreams. Charles Ponzi's lie was about creating value out of nothing. He took worthless paper and, through sheer confidence, turned it into a mountain of cash. It was a lie about finance. But sometimes, a lie can be about something else entirely. Not money, but art. And the next story is about two men who, out of sheer boredom and contempt, created a literary masterpiece from nonsense and fooled a nation's greatest critics. Story number 5. The Poet Who Never Lived and the Verses That Meant Nothing. The year is 1943. We're in Melbourne, Australia. Far from the battlefields of the Second World War, another kind of war is being waged. A war of words. On one side, you have the modernists, poets who love abstract, surreal, difficult art. They write poems that are dense and confusing, full of bizarre imagery and fractured grammar. On the other side, you have two young poets, James Macaulay and Harold Stewart. They're soldiers, serving in the army, but they are traditionalists at heart. They believe in rhythm, in rhyme, in clarity, and they absolutely hate the new modernist poetry. They think it's pretentious garbage. One afternoon, sitting in their army barracks, bored and annoyed, they decide to do something about it. They decide to conduct an experiment. Could they invent a modernist poet, write an entire collection of his work in a single afternoon, and get it published? Could they prove that the so-called experts couldn't tell the difference between genius and gibberish? They created their poet. They called him Ern Malley. They gave him a tragic backstory. A young mechanic, a man of the people, who had died tragically of a rare disease at the age of 25, leaving behind a bundle of unpublished experimental poems. It was the perfect romantic narrative for a tortured artist. Then, they started writing. But they didn't write in the traditional sense. They set out to create the worst poetry they possibly could. They threw out the rules. They opened random books, a dictionary, a textbook on mosquito drainage, an American report on the breeding grounds of eels, and picked out words and phrases. They mixed metaphors until they were meaningless. They jumbled sentences together. They deliberately wrote clunky, awkward, nonsensical lines. One of them would write a line, and the other would try to top it with something even more ridiculous. They were laughing the whole time. In one afternoon, they produced the entire posthumous collection of Ern Malley's work, titled The Darkening Ecliptic. The result was pure, unadulterated nonsense. Lines like, "I have been bitter with you, my sister, remembering that I had meant to praise your hams and the little faucet of your charity." Or, "The elephant, the oyster, and the owl, 3 of us, in the deep soak of the stream." It was a joke. A literary Frankenstein's monster, stitched together from scraps of other books. They sent the manuscript to a popular modernist literary magazine called Angry Penguins. The editor, a young and passionate champion of the new poetry named Max Harris, received the work, and he was blown away. He didn't see nonsense, he saw genius. He saw a raw, untrained talent, a voice from the Australian wilderness. This, he declared, was the authentic, brilliant poetry he had been searching for. He dedicated an entire issue of his magazine to the work of the late great Ern Malley, complete with a glowing introduction praising his surreal brilliance. The Ern Malley issue of Angry Penguins was a sensation. The modernists loved it. They wrote essays dissecting the deep psychological meaning behind the absurd verses. They hailed Malley as Australia's answer to Dylan Thomas and Rimbaud. And then, Macaulay and Stewart revealed the truth. The humiliation was total. The media had a field day. The modernist movement became a laughingstock. The editor, Max Harris, was utterly destroyed, his reputation in tatters. He was even prosecuted for publishing indecent material, the nonsensical poems, and was fined in court. He had championed a poet who didn't exist and praised work that was created as a deliberate insult. It's a fantastic story, isn't it? It's about how easily we can be fooled by presentation and expectation. The critics expected to find genius in difficult poetry, so they found it, even when it wasn't there. They were tricked by their own intellectual vanity. The hoax didn't just create a fake poet, it exposed a real emptiness at the heart of the art world. The lie of Ern Malley was a phantom built of words, a ghost in the literary machine. But some ghosts are much larger. They don't just haunt a magazine, they haunt the very maps we use to navigate the world. Our next story is about a place that, for more than 100 years, was as real as England on paper, but never existed on the sea. It was an island born from a mistake. Story number 6, the Phantom Islands that lived and died on paper. Imagine the world before satellites, before GPS, a world of wood, sail, and freezing salt spray. A world where the only thing standing between a ship's crew and a watery grave in the middle of a vast, featureless ocean was a piece of paper, a brass sextant, and the captain's steady hand. The maps were their Bible. If the map said there was land, there was land. It was a matter of life and death. Now let's journey to the South Atlantic. Down, down, past the tip of South America, into the furious seas between the Falkland Islands and Antarctica. This is the edge of the world, a place of howling winds, monstrous waves, and ice. It was here, in the year 1762, that a Spanish merchant ship, the Aurora, was blown off course. And in the midst of the storm, the captain saw it. Land. A small cluster of islands, uncharted and unknown. He marked it in his logbook, a new discovery. A few decades later, in 1794, another Spanish ship, the corvette Atrevida, was sent to confirm the sighting, and they found them. 3 rocky, desolate islands. They meticulously recorded the coordinates: 53 degrees south, 48 degrees west. The Aurora Islands, as they came to be known, were now official. They were real. And so, they began to appear on the maps. First, on the Spanish naval charts. Then, the British Admiralty charts, the most respected maps in the world. Once they were on there, it was gospel. For the next 100 years, the Aurora Islands were a fact of geography, a tiny, lonely outpost of reality on the edge of the map. But here's the thing. They weren't there. They never were. Sailors would hunt for them. Whalers and sealers, brave enough to venture into those icy waters, would follow their charts, hoping for a place to shelter from a storm. They'd arrive at the coordinates, 53 south, 48 west, and they'd find nothing. Just the endless, rolling, gray expanse of the Southern Ocean. Where were the islands? Had they miscalculated? Was the weather playing tricks on them? Think about the psychological effect. You trust your map implicitly. It says there is solid ground beneath your feet right here. But your eyes tell you there is only 1,000 fathoms of freezing water. Which do you believe? For decades, captains would report their failure to find the islands, but no one dared to remove them from the charts. Who would be so arrogant as to claim that both the Spanish and the British navies were wrong? It was easier to believe the islands were simply elusive. Finally, in the 1820s, the great Antarctic explorer James Weddell sailed on a specific mission to find them once and for all. He crisscrossed the recorded location. He spent days searching. Nothing. He declared them to be a phantom. But even that wasn't enough to kill them. The ghosts lingered on maps for decades more. So what did those sailors see? What was the source of this century-long illusion? The truth is likely a combination of things. The most probable culprit? Ice. Massive icebergs broken off from the Antarctic shelf can be the size of small countries. Covered in rock and debris from their journey, viewed from a distance in bad weather, they would look exactly like rocky islands. Or perhaps it was a shag rock, a tall, lonely pillar of stone that was mistaken for a larger landmass. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a simple, profound navigational error, repeated and solidified until it became fact. The Aurora Islands were a lie born from honest mistakes, amplified by the vastness and mystery of the sea. They were a testament to how easily our perception can be fooled, and how an error, once written down on an official document, can take on a life of its own. It was a harmless deception in the end, a ghost story for sailors. But not all great deceptions are accidents. Some are deliberate works of art, performed by con men so audacious, so charming, that they don't just sell you a fantasy. They try to sell you the most famous landmark in all of France. And, incredibly, they succeed. Story number 7. The Count Who Wrapped the Eiffel Tower in a Lie and Sold It for Scrap. Paris. The year is 1925. The Great War is a fading scar, and the city is electric. It's the jazz age. The lost generation is drinking in the cafes, artists are redefining reality in the garrets, and money, new money, is flowing like champagne. Anything truly feels possible. And there, in the center of it all, stands the Eiffel Tower. Today, it's a symbol of love, of France itself. But back then, not so much. You have to understand, it was only about 35 years old. It had been built as a temporary structure for the 1889 World's Fair. Many Parisians thought it was a hideous iron monstrosity, a blight on their beautiful skyline. And more than that, it was a problem. It needed constant painting, constant repairs. It was, in short, a giant, expensive headache for the city. Into this world glides Count Victor Lustig, a man who was not a count, whose name was probably not Victor Lustig, but who possessed something far more valuable than a title: absolute, unshakable confidence. He was fluent in several languages, dressed impeccably, and had the polished manners of old-world aristocracy. He was a creature of the grand hotels and first-class train compartments of Europe. And as he read a small newspaper article about the Eiffel Tower's maintenance problems, a spark of pure, audacious genius lit up in his mind. He began by spending a considerable sum of money to have official-looking government stationery forged. Then, he sent letters to the 5 most powerful scrap metal dealers in Paris. The letters were discreet, official, and urgent. They were invited to a confidential meeting at the Hôtel de Crillon, one of the most luxurious and historic hotels in the city. The subject? A business opportunity of national importance. The dealers arrived, nervous and intrigued. Lustig, introducing himself as a Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, greeted them in a lavishly rented suite. He let them enjoy the cocktails and the view. Then he got down to business. He spoke gravely about the overwhelming costs of the Eiffel Tower. The city, he explained, had made a secret and very painful decision. The tower was going to be torn down. Silence. Shock. Lustig explained that he was in charge of overseeing the demolition and the discreet sale of the 7,000 tons of scrap iron. The deal had to be kept in absolute secrecy, he stressed, to avoid public outcry. He was offering them, the titans of their industry, the chance to bid on this historic contract. He then took them all on an inspection tour of the tower in a rented limousine, flashing a fake government pass to get them into restricted areas. He didn't talk much. He just let the scale of the prize sink in. He had already chosen his mark. A man named André Poisson. Poisson was newer to the inner circle of Parisian business, a bit insecure, desperate to prove he belonged. Lustig sensed this immediately. When the bids came in, Lustig told Poisson that he had won. But then, a slight problem. Poisson's wife was suspicious. It all seemed too fast, too secret. The deal started to wobble. And here is the masterstroke. This is what separates a common crook from a genius like Lustig. Sensing Poisson's hesitation, Lustig arranged another meeting. He sighed, looked Poisson in the eye, and began to complain. He spoke of the life of a public servant, the low pay, the constant temptation. He wasn't asking for a bribe outright. Oh no, he was far too smooth for that. He was simply implying that a man in his position had certain expectations. And for André Poisson, that single moment changed everything. The request for a bribe didn't scare him off. It did the opposite. It made the entire scam feel real.
Of course a corrupt government official would want a kickback. This was how business was done. All his doubts vanished. He handed over a massive bribe and then paid the full purchase price for the Eiffel Tower. Lustig promised the official documents would arrive in a few days. Then he and his partner took the suitcase full of cash and boarded the next train to Vienna, never looking back. Lustig waited, checking the French newspapers every day for the explosion of headlines that would announce the great scam. Nothing. Not a word. He realized that André Poisson was too humiliated, too utterly embarrassed to ever go to the police. And Victor Lustig, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower, had an even more audacious thought. I should do that again. He returned to Paris a few months later and tried the exact same scam on a different group of dealers. But this time, the chosen mark went to the police before any money changed hands, and Lustig had to flee the country. Lustig's con was about pretending to be someone of importance for a single, brilliant score. But our next story is about a deception far more profound. It's about a woman who spent decades trying to convince the world she was someone else. Not for money, not for a landmark, but to reclaim a name that had been wiped out in a bloody revolution. Romanov. Story number 8. The Princess Who Came Back from the Dead. Let's go to Berlin. The year is 1920. The city is a chaotic swirl of survivors from the Great War. It's a place of ghosts, and one night, the police pull a young woman from the freezing waters of the Landwehr Canal. A failed suicide. She's taken to a mental asylum. She has no papers, no name, and she refuses to speak. She is a blank slate, her body covered in strange scars. For 2 years, she is just the unknown woman, Fräulein Unbekannt. She sits in silence, haunted by nightmares. Then one day, another patient shows her a magazine. There's a picture of the Russian imperial family, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 beautiful children, all of them executed by a Bolshevik firing squad in a cellar in Yekaterinburg 2 years earlier. The patient points to the youngest daughter, the Grand Duchess Anastasia, and the unknown woman begins to weep. The whisper starts, a rumor, a fragile, impossible hope. Could it be? The eyes look the same. The scars on her body. Could they be from bayonet wounds? The story spreads from the asylum to the community of Russian exiles living in Berlin. They are a broken people, a people who have lost everything. They are desperate for a miracle. And they come to see the girl from the canal. Some walk away shaking their heads. An imposter. But others fall to their knees. They claim to see the Romanov look in her eyes. She seems to know things, small, intimate details about life inside the palace that a stranger could never know. She calls a former lady-in-waiting by a secret childhood nickname. She recognizes a piece of family jewelry. Slowly, hesitantly, she begins to accept the identity they are giving her. She is Anastasia, miraculously saved from the massacre. And so began one of the longest and most bitter identity battles of the 20th century. The woman who came to be known as Anna Anderson became a living legend. For the next 60 years, she lived a life funded by believers. She was examined by doctors, interrogated by private investigators, and presented to the surviving relatives of the Romanovs. And the battle lines were drawn. The evidence for her was entirely emotional. She had a certain aristocratic arrogance. She seemed to have memories, flashes of a life of unimaginable luxury, followed by utter terror. The evidence against her, however, was concrete and damning. She refused, for instance, to speak Russian, the native language of the princess she claimed to be, saying the trauma had made her forget. Gleb Botkin,
the son of the Tsar's personal physician who was killed alongside the family, became her fiercest champion. But the Grand Duchess Olga, Anastasia's own aunt, met with her and declared flatly, "You are not my niece." Think about that. For decades, she lived in this limbo, this state of being maybe royalty. She fought a 30-year legal battle in the German courts to be officially recognized and to claim a share of the Romanov fortune. She lost. Yet for thousands of people, she was Anastasia. The story was just too good, too romantic, too hopeful to be untrue. It was a fairy tale that had survived the brutal reality of the 20th century. The final answer didn't come until after she died in 1984, and it didn't come from a court or a memory. It came from a laboratory. Science had advanced. The new magic of DNA testing had arrived. In the 1990s, scientists were able to locate a tissue sample from Anna Anderson, preserved from a long-ago medical procedure. They compared her DNA with that of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, a known maternal relative of the Romanovs. There was no match. None. It was over. The ghost was finally laid to rest. Further tests eventually proved what private investigators had suspected for decades. She was almost certainly a missing Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, who had a history of mental illness and had disappeared around the time the unknown woman was pulled from the canal. Her entire life was a lie. Or was it? Did she, at some point, come to believe her own story? Was she a cynical fraud, or a deeply traumatized woman who latched on to a grand identity to escape a painful reality? We'll never know. Her deception was about rewriting a personal history, but our next story is about a lie that was even more ambitious. It wasn't about fooling a family. It was about fooling the world with a forgery that promised to rewrite the very history of the Second World War. Story number 9. The secret thoughts of a monster that were worth millions. The year is 1983. The world is still deeply divided by the Cold War. Germany itself is a nation split in two by a wall, and the shadow of the Second World War, though 40 years gone, is long and dark. The central figure of that shadow, Adolf Hitler, is less a man and more a black hole in history, a symbol of absolute evil. We knew what he did, but what did he think? What were his private, secret thoughts? To know that, well, that would be the greatest historical discovery of the century. Enter Gerd Heidemann, a star reporter for the German magazine Stern. Heidemann was a man obsessed. He spent his life and his fortune collecting Nazi memorabilia, even owning Hermann Göring's old yacht. He was deep in a murky world of collectors, forgers, and old Nazis. And through this world, he found a source. A man who claimed to have a historical treasure beyond imagination. 60 small black leather-bound books. Their alleged origin was the stuff of legend. They had supposedly been on a plane that crashed in East Germany in the final days of the war, in April of 1945. The plane was carrying Hitler's personal effects out of Berlin. The books, his private diaries, were said to have been recovered from the wreckage by local farmers and hidden away for decades behind the Iron Curtain, now secretly smuggled to the West. It was the ultimate scoop, the publishing equivalent of finding the Holy Grail. Stern magazine, without hesitating, opened its checkbook. They paid a staggering 9.3 million German marks, an almost unbelievable sum. They locked the diaries in a vault and brought in the experts. Hugh Trevor Roper, a renowned British historian, flew in. He examined the sheer volume of the material, the mundane details, and the apparent consistency of the handwriting. He made a fateful decision. He declared them authentic. The world held its breath. On April 25, 1983, Stern held a massive press conference. The flashbulbs popped. The reporters were in a frenzy. This was it. History was being rewritten. The magazine published its first explosive excerpt. And what did the secret diaries of the Führer contain? What dark philosophies and master plans were hidden in their pages? Honestly, the most banal, boring, self-pitying nonsense you can possibly imagine. The diaries portrayed Hitler not as a raving ideologue, but as a man preoccupied with his health and his daily schedule. More incredibly, they suggested he had no knowledge of the Holocaust. They were, in essence, a pathetic attempt to normalize history's greatest monster. And for a few days, the world, or at least a part of it, bought it. The story was just too big, too sensational to be false. But the lie was sloppy, incredibly sloppy. As other historians and forensic experts demanded access, the deception crumbled almost immediately. It didn't take weeks, it took hours. The German Federal Archives got their hands on a few volumes, and the verdict came back with crushing, humiliating speed. It was a fraud, a grotesque and obvious one. The paper contained whiteners that weren't developed until after the war. The ink was modern. The polyester threads in the bindings were post-war. The glue was post-war. The covers were cheap imitations, and the AH monogram on the front was a well-known fake that had been sold to collectors for years. The entire thing was a sham. The greatest scoop of the century became the greatest media scandal of the century. Stern's reputation was left in smoking ruins. The reporter, Heidemann, was disgraced. And the source of the diaries? He wasn't some shadowy figure from East German intelligence. He was a Stuttgart artist and small-time con man named Konrad Kujau, a master forger. He hadn't just faked the handwriting, he'd written the entire 60 volumes himself, mostly by copying details from history books and filling the rest with his own mundane inventions. He watched the press conference on television, laughing. The Hitler diaries were a physical deception, a lie you could hold in your hand. They pretended to be the product of a human mind. But our next story is about a deception that went one step further. It wasn't a fake diary, it was a fake mind. A brilliant thinking machine that could challenge the greatest men of its age. A mechanical marvel that held a very human secret in its clockwork heart. Story number 10. The thinking machine that was secretly a man in a box. The year is 1770. We are in the opulent Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, at the court of the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa. The air is thick with powdered wigs, silk, and the scent of beeswax. And in the center of the room is a strange and marvelous new invention, presented by its creator, a Hungarian nobleman named Wolfgang von Kempelen. It is an automaton. A life-sized wooden figure of a man, carved in the Turkish style, with a magnificent mustache and piercing gray eyes. He sits behind a large wooden cabinet, about 4 feet long and 3 feet high. On top of the cabinet is a chessboard. This is the Turk, a mechanical man that can play chess. And not just play, it can win. Kempelen, a master showman, begins his demonstration. He opens every door of the cabinet, one by one. The crowd sees a dazzling and complex array of clockwork gears, levers, and cogs. He even holds a candle inside so they can see all the way through the machinery. There is no hidden compartment. There is no trick. This is a machine, pure and simple. He then invites a challenger from the court. A brave nobleman sits down. Kempelen winds a large key on the side of the cabinet. The machine whirs to life. The Turk's head turns, scanning the board. Its wooden arm lifts, its fingers grasp a chess piece, and it makes its move. The game begins. And the Turk is brilliant. It plays a strong, aggressive game. It nods its head twice when it puts the opponent's queen in check. If the human makes an illegal move, the Turk shakes its head, picks up the offending piece, and puts it back. It is not just moving pieces, it seems to be thinking. The court is mesmerized, speechless. They are witnessing a miracle of science, a mechanical mind. The Turk, of course, wins the game. For the next 80 years, the Turk was the most famous machine in the world. It toured Europe and America. It defeated Benjamin Franklin in Paris. It beat Napoleon Bonaparte, who was so frustrated he tried to cheat, only to have the automaton sweep all the pieces from the board in a fit of mechanical anger. It seemed unstoppable. It was the world's first true artificial intelligence. Except, of course, it wasn't. The secret was as ingenious as the machinery was complex. Inside that cramped wooden cabinet, hidden among the fake clockwork, was a secret sliding seat and a hidden chamber. And inside that chamber was a man. A very small, very brilliant chess master. The entire cabinet was a masterpiece of misdirection. The doors were designed so that when one side was open, the operator could slide to the other, remaining hidden from view. The machinery the audience saw was just window dressing. The real operator worked by candlelight, moving a system of levers that controlled the Turk's arm. He followed the game using a clever system of magnets. Each chess piece had a small magnet on its base, and underneath the board, on the operator's side, was a corresponding set of tiny metal balls on strings. When a piece was lifted on top, a ball would drop. When it was placed on a new square, another ball would be attracted upwards. The operator in the box could see the entire game in the dark. It was an exhausting, sweltering, and claustrophobic job. A succession of brilliant, usually short, chess masters were hired over the decades to be the ghost in the machine. They were the Turks' real brain. The deception survived for so long because it was simply too elegant, too far ahead of its time for anyone to conceive of the real solution. People wanted to believe in the mechanical mind. It spoke to their era's faith in science and progress. It was far more exciting to believe in a clockwork genius than in a cramped, sweating man hidden in a box. The Turk was a lie that pretended to be a man-made brain. But the next story is even stranger. It's about a highly respected scientist who didn't just fool others. He managed to fool himself, convincing the entire French scientific community to see rays of light that simply were not there. Story number 11. The rays of light that only one man could see. The year is 1903. The world of physics is in a state of thrilling chaos. X-rays had been discovered just a few years earlier. Radioactivity was the new frontier. It seemed like every week the universe was revealing a new, invisible force. The air in every laboratory in Europe was buzzing with the possibility of the next great discovery. In France, there was Professor Prosper René Blondelot. He was a distinguished physicist, a member of the French Academy of Sciences, a man with a solid, respected reputation, and he was experimenting with X-rays. One day, while working in a darkened room, he noticed something. A faint, subtle brightening of an electric spark when he held it near his X-ray equipment. The change was tiny, almost imperceptible, but Blondelot was convinced it was real. He believed he had discovered a new kind of radiation, something entirely different from X-rays. He called them N-rays for the University of Nancy where he worked. He began to study these mysterious rays with a fanatic's devotion. He found they could be produced by certain metals and even by the human body. He discovered they could be focused by aluminum lenses and refracted by aluminum prisms. He designed experiments to prove their existence. The problem was, the only way to detect N-rays was with the naked eye, in a nearly dark room, by observing a minuscule change in the brightness of a faint light source. It was entirely subjective. And here is where things get truly strange. Others started to see them too. Blondelot published his findings, and soon, dozens of other French scientists were confirming his results. Over 100 papers were published on the properties of N-rays. They were a scientific fact in France. The nation was proud. They had their own unique form of radiation to rival the German X-ray. But outside of France, no one could replicate the experiments. Scientists in Britain, Germany, and America tried. They saw nothing. The French physicists insisted that this was because their senses were simply not as refined. The Anglo-Saxons, they implied, were not as sensitive and observant as the French. Seeing N-rays became a point of national pride. The skepticism grew until an American physicist named Robert Wood decided to visit Blondelot's laboratory to see for himself. Wood was a brilliant experimentalist known for his love of exposing frauds. He arrived at Blondelot's lab and was ushered into the darkened room for a demonstration. Blondelot set up his famous experiment. An aluminum prism would refract the N-rays and project a spectrum of them onto a screen. Blondelot would then move a detector along the screen, calling out when he saw the N-ray lines, which were, of course, completely invisible to Wood. And then, while Blondelot's back was turned in the near-total darkness, Wood did something audacious. He quietly reached out and palmed the aluminum prism from the apparatus. He slipped it into his pocket. The core component of the entire experiment was gone. Then he asked Blondlow to repeat the measurement. Blondlow, completely unaware, did so, and he saw the N-rays just as clearly as before. He called out the measurements, identifying the lines of a non-existent spectrum created by a non-existent prism. It was over. Robert Wood published his findings in the journal Nature. He didn't call Blondlow a fraud. He was more subtle and far more devastating. He simply described what he had seen, or rather, what Blondlow had claimed to see even after the experiment had been sabotaged. The N-ray phenomenon collapsed overnight. It was a case of mass delusion, a psychological epidemic where an entire group of scientists, led by a well-intentioned but profoundly self-deceived man, saw what they desperately wanted to see. Their desire for discovery was so strong, it literally created a phantom in their own minds. Blondlow's deception was a lie woven from light that wasn't there. It was a ghost in the eye of the observer. But the next artifact in our collection is not a ghost. It is a solid object. A piece of linen cloth bearing the faint image of a man. A relic so powerful and so controversial, it has been the subject of bitter debate for centuries, pitting faith against science in a battle over what is real. Story number 12. The Holy Photograph from Before the Invention of Photography. In the city of Turin in northern Italy, kept in a climate-controlled, bulletproof case, lies a single piece of ancient linen cloth. It's about 14 feet long, yellowish with age, and marked by the burns and water stains of a long and perilous history. Imprinted on its surface is the faint, sepia-toned negative image of a man. A tall, bearded man with long hair. His body is marked with wounds that correspond with startling accuracy to the biblical accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The crown of thorns, the scourging, the nail wounds in the wrists and feet, the spear wound in the side. This is the Shroud of Turin. For countless believers, this is not just an image. It is the actual burial cloth of Jesus, miraculously imprinted with his image at the moment of his resurrection. It is a tangible link to the central event of Christianity. A holy photograph created 2,000 years before the invention of photography. Its power is immense. People weep in its presence. But the history of the shroud is as murky as its image. It doesn't appear clearly in the historical record until the mid-14th century, in the possession of a French knight in the small town of Lorraine, France. And almost immediately, it was embroiled in controversy. The local bishop, Bishop Pierre Darcy, investigated the matter and wrote a blistering report to the Pope. He declared the shroud to be a fraud, cunningly painted, and even claimed to have found the artist who had confessed to faking it. The church ordered the image to be exhibited only if it was explicitly stated to be a representation and not the true cloth. But a story that powerful is hard to contain. The shroud's mystique only grew. It was bought and sold, passed through the hands of royalty, and eventually ended up with the House of Savoy in Turin, where it remains today. The real battle, the one that defines the shroud in the modern era, began in 1898. An amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was allowed to photograph the cloth for the first time. He took the glass plate negative back to his darkroom, and as the image developed in the chemical bath, his jaw dropped. The faint, ghostly image on the cloth, when seen in photographic negative, became a startlingly clear and detailed positive portrait. It was a man's face, noble and serene in death. It was a revelation. How could a medieval forger have created a perfect photographic negative centuries before the concept was even understood? This discovery supercharged the belief in the shroud's authenticity. It seemed to be proof that it could not be the work of a human artist. For the next century, the debate raged. Scientists, who called themselves syndenologists, studied every fiber. They found traces of human blood, or something very similar. They found pollen grains from plants that grow only in the Holy Land. The evidence seemed to point in two directions at once. Then, in 1988, the Vatican finally agreed to the definitive test. A small sample was cut from a corner of the shroud and sent to 3 separate world-renowned laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. They would use the most advanced technique available, accelerator mass spectrometry carbon-14 dating. Science would finally give a definitive answer. The results came back, and they were unanimous. The linen cloth of the Shroud of Turin was not from the time of Christ. The laboratories dated the material to a period between the years 1260 and 1390. The exact time it first appeared in France. The exact time Bishop Darcy had called it a fake. For the scientific community, the case was closed. It was a fake. A brilliant, artistically masterful, and perhaps piously intended medieval forgery. How it was made remains a mystery. Some suggest a primitive photographic technique using silver nitrate, others a sophisticated rubbing or dusting method. But its age was no longer in question. For believers, however, the story was not over. They questioned the validity of the sample, suggesting it was taken from a corner that had been repaired in the Middle Ages. They continue to argue that the image's unique properties defy any known explanation of forgery. And so the lie, if it is a lie, persists. It is too powerful, too meaningful, to be destroyed by a single scientific result. It exists in a strange space between faith and fact, a mystery that people see not just with their eyes, but with their souls. The Shroud of Turin was a singular object, a masterpiece of deception if you believe the science. But our next story is about a family who turned deception into a family business. They didn't just create one masterpiece. They created hundreds, churning out fakes of every style and era from a shed in their garden, and fooling the greatest museums in the world. Story number 13, The Family Forgery Factory in the Garden Shed. Picture a quiet working-class town in the north of England, Bolton, a place of brick houses and gray skies. And in the garden of one of these houses, there is a small shed. It's a bit rickety. From the outside, you'd think it was full of lawn mowers and rusty tools. But inside that shed, an astonishing secret was being kept for 17 years. This was the workshop of the Greenhalgh family. There was Sean, the son, the quiet, self-taught artistic prodigy. There was Olive, the mother, who handled the correspondence, and there was George, the 84-year-old father, the front man, who would show up at the world's most prestigious auction houses and museums, confined to a wheelchair, looking frail and a little confused, clutching a priceless artifact that he claimed had been in his family for generations. And the art world bought it, literally. For 17 years, from 1989 to 2006, the Greenhalghs sold a staggering range of fakes. And when I say range, I mean it. They didn't just specialize in one thing. Sean Greenhalgh could seemingly make anything. An ancient Assyrian relief sculpture? No problem. A Roman silver platter? He could do that. An oil painting by the forgotten American artist L.S. Lowry? He could paint one. He made sculptures in the style of Barbara Hepworth and Man Ray. He made ceramics. He made Celtic jewelry. He even faked a document signed by Winston Churchill. His masterpiece was a small, delicate alabaster statuette of an Egyptian princess, said to be from the tomb of Tutankhamun's father. He carved it using basic tools in his shed, aged it with a mixture of tea and clay, and then sold it to the Bolton Museum for nearly £500,000. It stayed on display as a genuine treasure of Amarna art for 10 years. This was the genius of their deception. They didn't just create forgeries, they created stories. Olive would write letters, often claiming to be the executor of a will, saying these items had just been discovered in an old family estate. George, playing the role of the slightly dotty but honest old pensioner, was the perfect frontman. Who would suspect an old man in a wheelchair of being part of a sophisticated international art fraud? He'd tell a charming, rambling story about how his grandfather had acquired the piece, and the experts, blinded by the quality of the object and the disarming performance, would believe him. They were not just forgers, they were brilliant social engineers. They understood the psychology of the art world. They knew that experts want to discover things. They craved that eureka moment. The Greenhalghs didn't just sell them an object, they sold them the thrill of discovery. So how did it all unravel? Not because of any single mistake with an ancient masterpiece. It unraveled because of 3 Assyrian relief sculptures. They had offered them for sale to the British Museum. The museum's experts examined them and were deeply impressed. They were about to authenticate them. But one expert noticed something, a tiny, almost invisible detail. The cuneiform inscription, the ancient wedge-shaped writing, contained a spelling mistake, a typo. The kind of error a genuine Assyrian stone carver from the 7th century BC would never make, but that a modern forger, copying from a textbook, might. That single typo was the thread that, when pulled, brought the entire 17-year-long deception crashing down. Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit launched an investigation. They raided the small house in Bolton, and in that garden shed, they found the evidence. The tools, the raw materials, the half-finished fakes. The greatest and most diverse art forgery ring in modern British history had been run by a quiet man, his mother, and his father out of a shed.
The Greenhalgh lie was about faking history for profit. But our next story is about a lie told not for money, but for professional glory. It's about a scientist who was so desperate for a breakthrough that he decided to help his experiment along with a black felt-tip pen. Story number 14. The scientist who cured transplant rejection with a magic marker. The year is 1974. We're at the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research in New York City. At the time, it was one of the most prestigious medical research centers on the planet, and one of its rising stars was a man named Dr. William Summerlin. He was an immunologist working on the holy grail of transplant science, figuring out a way to overcome the body's natural rejection of foreign tissue. If you could transplant skin or even organs from one person to another without the recipient's immune system attacking it, it would change medicine forever. Summerlin claimed he had found a way, a revolutionary, almost ridiculously simple technique. He said that by keeping the donor tissue in a special culture medium for a few weeks, he could lower its antigenicity. In simple terms, he could make it immunologically quieter so the recipient's body wouldn't recognize it as foreign. It was a miracle cure for tissue rejection. To prove his breakthrough, he conducted a series of experiments. His most famous demonstration involved grafting patches of skin from black mice onto the backs of white mice. Ordinarily, the white mice's immune systems would violently reject the foreign black skin within days. But Summerlin's mice were different. Weeks after the procedure, the black skin patches were still there, healthy and accepted. He had done it. He had conquered the rejection barrier. His discovery made him a scientific celebrity. He was praised in newspapers, given a prestigious position, and his work was held up as a shining example of the brilliant research being done at Sloan Kettering. But, just like with the N-rays, other scientists couldn't replicate his results. No matter how carefully they followed his methods, their mice always rejected the grafts. When questioned, Summerlin was evasive. He suggested that they just weren't as skilled as he was, that a certain knack was required. The pressure began to mount. The whole incredible deception came crashing down in a single, bizarre moment. One morning, a lab assistant was checking on the famous mice. He noticed something odd about one of the black patches on a white mouse. It looked smudged. Curious, he dabbed the patch with a bit of alcohol. The black color wiped right off. It wasn't a skin graft. It was ink. Summerlin, desperate to produce the results he had promised, had taken a white mouse and simply colored in a patch on its back with a black felt-tip marker. The discovery sent a shockwave through the institute. The director of Sloan Kettering, a respected immunologist himself, confronted Summerlin. At first, Summerlin denied it, but the evidence was undeniable. His other experiments were scrutinized and found to be riddled with inconsistencies and falsified results. The miracle was a complete fabrication. Summerlin was fired in disgrace. An investigation later concluded that he was suffering from a severe mental and emotional exhaustion, driven by the intense publish or perish pressure of modern science. He wasn't trying to get rich. He was just a man so desperate to make the breakthrough he believed was possible that he decided to cheat. His lie wasn't sophisticated.
It was crude, simple, and born of desperation. It was the scientific equivalent of a child coloring in the answers on a test. Summerlin's lie was about faking a medical miracle to advance his career. But the next deception in our files is far more sinister. It's not about fooling colleagues, it's about fooling the desperate and the dying. It's the story of a man who took apricot pits, gave them a scientific-sounding name, and sold them to cancer patients as a cure.
Story number 15, the miracle cancer cure made from apricot pits. Let's start in the 1950s. The war on cancer is in its early stages. The treatments, brutal surgery, radiation, early chemotherapy, are often as feared as the disease itself. For many, a cancer diagnosis is a death sentence. And into this world of fear and desperation steps a man named Ernst Krebs Sr., and later, his son Ernst Krebs Jr. They were not medical doctors in the traditional sense, but they had a theory, a grand unifying theory of cancer. They claimed that cancer was not caused by a virus or a genetic mutation. No, they said, cancer was simply a vitamin deficiency, a nutritional disease. And like any other deficiency disease, like scurvy or pellagra, it could be cured by replacing the missing nutrient. And what was this miracle nutrient? They called it vitamin B17. It sounded plausible. It sounded scientific. Vitamin B17. It has the ring of legitimate biochemistry. But there was a problem. There is no such thing as vitamin B17. It doesn't exist. Krebs just made it up. So what was this substance he was promoting? Its chemical name is amygdalin, a compound found in the seeds of many fruits, most notably in apricot pits. Amygdalin has a unique property. When it is metabolized by the body, it releases cyanide. Yes, that cyanide. The fast-acting, lethal poison. Krebs and his followers developed a bizarre and completely fabricated theory to explain how this worked. They claimed that cancer cells contained a special enzyme that would unlock the cyanide from the amygdalin molecule, killing the cancer cell. Normal, healthy cells, they argued, did not have this enzyme and could safely neutralize the poison. Therefore, vitamin B17 was a magic bullet that would target and destroy cancer while leaving the rest of the body unharmed. It was a beautiful, elegant theory, and it was a complete and utter lie. There is absolutely no scientific evidence to support any of it. But the story was powerful. It was a story of a natural, gentle cure that the medical establishment, in collusion with Big Pharma, was trying to suppress because there was no money to be made from apricot pits. They gave the purified, concentrated form of amygdalin a catchy, marketable name, Laetrile, and they began to sell it to cancer patients. Desperate people who had been told by their doctors that there was no hope, flocked to clinics in Mexico and other countries to receive Laetrile treatments. They paid thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, for the promise of a cure. The medical community was horrified. The FDA, the American Cancer Society, the National Cancer Institute, every major medical and scientific body in the world examined the claims and found them to be baseless. Not only did Laetrile not cure cancer, it was actively dangerous. Patients who took it in high doses were suffering from classic cyanide poisoning, nausea, vomiting, headaches, and in some documented cases, death. But the movement had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer a scientific debate. It was a cultural one. Laetrile became a symbol of medical freedom, of the individual's right to choose their own treatment, even if that treatment was proven to be worthless and toxic. Celebrities endorsed it. Grassroots organizations fought for its legalization. The lie persisted for decades, long after Ernst Krebs Jr. was gone. It preyed on the deepest of human fears and the most powerful of hopes. It was a deception that offered a simple, natural solution to a complex, terrifying disease. And for people in the darkest moments of their lives, that simple lie was often more appealing than the complicated, painful truth. Krebs's lie was about creating a fake medicine. But the next deception we'll examine is even more audacious. It's about a forger who didn't just create a fake painting or a fake diary.
He created fake history itself, writing letters from figures like Cleopatra and Jesus Christ, and writing them all in French. Story number 16. The man who sold Cleopatra's letters to a genius. In French. The year is 1861. Paris, the Second French Empire under Napoleon III. It is a time of immense national pride and scientific fervor, and at the very pinnacle of French science is a man named Michel Chasles. He is not a minor figure, he is a giant. A brilliant mathematician, a member of the French Academy of Sciences, a man of immense intellect, and, as it would turn out, even immenser gullibility. One day, Chasles was approached by a man named Vrain Lucas. Lucas was a calligrapher, a man with a genius for imitating handwriting. He came to Chasles with a story. He claimed to have access to a massive, secret collection of historical documents, rescued from a chateau that was about to be destroyed during the French Revolution. And what a collection it was! Lucas began to sell the documents to Chasles, piece by piece. At first, they were plausible enough. Letters from French poets and playwrights. But then, the collection began to get more impressive. A letter from Dante Alighieri, a letter from Alexander the Great to Aristotle, and Chasles, the great mathematician, bought them all. Vrain Lucas was a man who understood his customer. He realized that Chasles was not just a scientist, he was a passionate French patriot. And Chasles held a deep-seated belief that French culture was the true wellspring of all great Western thought. So, Lucas began to tailor his forgeries to fit this patriotic obsession. The collection grew more and more incredible. Lucas discovered a letter from Cleopatra to Julius Caesar, professing her love. He produced correspondence from Mary Magdalene, written from her supposed retirement home in the south of France. He even had a letter from Lazarus, the man raised from the dead, written to St. Peter. And here is the most magnificent, most mind-bogglingly absurd part of the entire affair. Every single one of these letters, from ancient Greece, from Rome, from biblical Judea, was written in the same language. And not just the same language, but the same anachronistic 19th century style French. Think about that. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, writing in French. Mary Magdalene, a contemporary of Jesus, writing in French. Alexander the Great, writing in French. And Michel Chasles, one of the most brilliant men in France, saw nothing wrong with this. Nothing at all. His patriotism provided the perfect excuse. He went before the Academy of Sciences and presented his prize acquisition. A series of letters from the French scientist Blaise Pascal to the English scientist Isaac Newton. The letters proved that it was Pascal, not Newton, who had first developed the law of universal gravitation. It was a triumph for France. The English, he argued, had stolen the credit. The other scientists in the Academy were skeptical. They pointed out some rather glaring problems, like the fact that Pascal had died before Newton had even formulated his theories. Chasles was unswayed. He had the letters. He had the proof. The whole thing reached its climax when Chasles, to prove the authenticity of his collection, produced the most spectacular letter of all. A letter from Vercingetorix, the ancient Gaulish chieftain who fought against Caesar, written to Julius Caesar himself, in French, on paper watermarked with the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of the French monarchy. It was too much. The fraud was so blatant, so utterly comical, that it could no longer be ignored. Vrain Lucas was arrested. During his trial, it was revealed that he had forged an astonishing 27,000 documents in total. He wasn't a historian. He was a one-man factory of fake history. He would simply get old paper by taking the blank fly leaves from old books and then write whatever he thought his star customer would buy. And Chasles bought it all. Lucas was sent to prison, and Michel Chasles became a laughingstock. A cautionary tale of how a brilliant mind can be blinded by its own cherished beliefs. Lucas's forgeries were designed to flatter a nation's pride. But our next story is about a forgery with a much darker purpose. A document created not to entertain a single academic, but to poison the minds of millions. A lie so potent and so evil that it would be used to justify hatred and murder for a century to come. Story number 17, the conspiracy theory that became a warrant for genocide. The story begins around the year 1903 in the paranoid and repressive atmosphere of Tsarist Russia. The Russian Empire is teetering on the brink of collapse. There is widespread poverty, revolutionary fervor, and deep social unrest. And the government, desperate to deflect blame from its own incompetence, needs a scapegoat. A familiar, ancient scapegoat. It was in this environment that a short, dry, and utterly terrifying document began to circulate. It was called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It purported to be the secret minutes of a meeting of a cabal of Jewish leaders, a shadow government, who had gathered in secret to finalize their master plan for total world domination. The plan it described was diabolical. The elders would use their control of banking and the media to manipulate world events. They would start wars, create economic crises, promote immorality, and corrupt governments from within. They would destroy Christianity and all existing social orders, paving the way for a single global Jewish kingdom. The document was detailed, specific, and written in a chillingly calm and methodical tone. It read like a genuine secret agenda, and for a public steeped in centuries of anti-Semitic prejudice and increasingly desperate for a simple explanation for their suffering, it was electrifying. It was the proof they were looking for. All the chaos and misery in the world wasn't the fault of the Tsar or the system. It was the fault of a secret, invisible enemy plotting in the shadows. But the protocols were a complete and utter fraud, a crude and vicious forgery. Journalistic and scholarly investigations later proved, beyond any doubt, that the document was plagiarized. Large sections of it were lifted, almost word for word, from a completely unrelated French political satire written in the 1860s called The Dialogue in Hell Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. That book was a critique of Napoleon III. It had nothing to do with Jewish people at all. The forgers, likely working for the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, simply took that text, replaced Napoleon with the Jews, and added their own hateful flourishes. The lie was exposed almost immediately. The Times of London ran a definitive series of articles in 1921, showing the plagiarism side by side. But it didn't matter. The truth never had a chance. The lie was too useful. The protocols were translated into dozens of languages and spread across the globe. In America, the industrialist Henry Ford, a virulent anti-Semite, funded the printing of 500,000 copies and distributed them through his car dealerships. And in Germany, a young, failed artist and political agitator named Adolf Hitler read the protocols. And he believed them. Or, at the very least, he recognized their immense power. The document became a cornerstone of Nazi ideology. It was taught in German schools as fact. It was used as a justification for the Nuremberg laws, for Kristallnacht, and ultimately for the Holocaust. It was a forgery that served as a death warrant for millions of people. Even today, after being debunked for over a century, the lie will not die. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are still published, still circulated, and still believed by conspiracy theorists and hate groups all over the world. It is a ghost of a lie that continues to haunt us, a testament to the terrifying power of a well-crafted deception to take root in the fertile soil of fear and prejudice. This was a lie designed to deceive a population and incite hatred. But our next story is about a very different kind of deception. It was a lie told not to start a war, but to win one. A brilliant, macabre piece of theater orchestrated by British intelligence to trick the entire German High Command. Story number 18. The Man Who Never Was and the Invasion That Never Happened. The year is 1943, the height of the Second World War. The Allied forces have driven the Germans and Italians out of North Africa and are preparing for the next logical step, the invasion of Europe. The most obvious target, the soft underbelly of Europe, is the island of Sicily. It's a short hop across the Mediterranean, has a manageable coastline, and would provide a perfect staging ground for the invasion of mainland Italy. There was just one problem. It was so obvious that the Germans knew it too. They were heavily fortifying Sicily, moving in elite divisions, and preparing for the inevitable assault. A direct invasion would be a bloodbath. The Allies needed a way to convince the German high command that they were going to attack somewhere else. They needed a lie. A big one. The idea was born in the mind of a British intelligence officer named Ewan Montague, inspired by a memo from another officer, Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond. The idea was simple, but brilliant in its ghoulish detail. They would get a dead body, dress it up as a British officer, plant fake secret documents on it, and then dump it in the sea off the coast of Spain, hoping it would wash ashore and the documents would fall into the hands of German spies. They called it Operation Mincemeat. First, they needed a body. They procured the corpse of a homeless man named Glyndŵr Michael, who had recently died in London from ingesting rat poison. The coroner was brought into the conspiracy. The cause of death on the official records was changed to look consistent with drowning. Then, they needed to give this body a life. They couldn't just have a nameless corpse. It had to be a real person. They created a fictional identity, Captain, Acting Major, William Martin of the Royal Marines. They gave him a backstory, a personality. They wrote him love letters from a fictitious fiancée named Pam, complete with a photograph. They gave him a stern letter from his father and a warning from his bank manager about an overdraft. They put ticket stubs from a London theater show in his pockets. They even gave him an angry letter from a landlord. Every detail was designed to create the illusion of a real, believable man. Major Martin was not a corpse. He was a person. Finally, the most important part, the documents. Chained to Major Martin's wrist in a leather briefcase was a personal letter from one top British general to another. Tucked inside, in a casual, offhand manner, was the crucial piece of misinformation. The letter mentioned that while one Allied army was preparing to attack Sicily as a feint, the real targets for the main invasions were Greece and Sardinia. The body of Major Martin was packed in dry ice, placed in a special canister, and loaded onto the submarine HMS Seraph. The submarine sailed to a point off the coast of Huelva, Spain, a town known to have a very active and very efficient German intelligence agent. In the pre-dawn hours of April 30th, 1943, the crew gently slipped the body into the water, where the currents would carry it to shore. It worked perfectly. The body was found by a fisherman. The Spanish authorities, though officially neutral, were sympathetic to the Nazis. They allowed the German agent to borrow the briefcase for a few hours. The letters were carefully opened, photographed, and then resealed. The briefcase and the body were returned to the British. The Germans thought their intelligence coup was a complete secret, and Adolf Hitler bought the lie. Hook, line, and sinker. Convinced that the documents were genuine, he overruled his own generals. He ordered panzer divisions to be moved from France to Greece. He sent troops to reinforce Sardinia. He diverted ships and resources away from Sicily. He was defending against a ghost invasion. On July 10th, when the Allies finally launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, they were met with surprisingly light resistance. The island was taken far more quickly and with far fewer casualties than anyone had dared to hope. The man who never was, Major William Martin, had saved thousands of lives. It was one of the most successful and brilliantly executed deceptions of the entire war. Operation Mincemeat was a lie designed to fool the highest levels of military intelligence. But our next story takes us from the battlefields of Europe to the pages of a newspaper in New York, and a lie that was aimed at a much wider audience. A lie about discovering life on the moon. Story number 19. The Batman on the Moon Who Sold a Lot of Newspapers. The year is 1835, New York City. The penny press is in full swing. Newspapers, for the first time, are cheap and accessible to everyone. Competition is fierce. Every editor is desperate for a story that will make his paper stand out, a story that will capture the public's imagination and, more importantly, sell copies. And no editor was more desperate than Benjamin Day of the New York Sun. His paper was new, and it was struggling. He needed a sensation. On August 25, 1835, he published the first of a six-part series that would become one of the most famous hoaxes in the history of journalism. The articles were allegedly reprinted from a supplement to the Edinburgh Journal of Science. They reported on the astonishing discoveries made by Sir John Herschel, one of the most famous and respected astronomers of the day. According to the articles, Herschel had built a revolutionary new telescope of immense size and power at an observatory in Cape Town, South Africa. This telescope was so powerful, it could magnify the surface of the moon to the point where objects just a few inches in size were clearly visible. It was, the paper claimed, like bringing the moon to within 100 yards of the Earth. The first article was a dry, technical description of the telescope. It was dense with scientific jargon, most of it completely made up, but it sounded utterly convincing. It was the bait. The second article was the hook. It described what Herschel had seen through his magnificent new instrument. He had discovered life on the moon. He saw vast forests of strange, triangular trees. He saw oceans and beaches of white sand. He saw herds of strange, bison-like creatures and a bizarre, blue, unicorn-like goat. The public was captivated. This wasn't speculation. It was being reported as scientific fact, attributed to the most famous astronomer alive. But it was the fourth article that caused a sensation. Herschel, the article claimed, had finally found intelligent life. He had focused his telescope on a volcanic crater and had seen them. Creatures that were, in his words, Vespertilio homo, or Batmen. They were humanoid, about 4 feet tall, covered in fine copper-colored hair, and had vast membranous wings like a bat, which they used to fly gracefully through the lunar air. He had even witnessed them gathering around a mysterious ruby-colored temple, engaging in some form of worship. New York City went into a frenzy. The circulation of the New York Sun skyrocketed, becoming for a time the best-selling newspaper in the entire world. People weren't just reading the story, they were believing it. Religious groups held meetings to discuss what it meant for Christian theology and how they might send missionaries to the moon. Other newspapers, caught completely flat-footed, had no choice but to reprint the Sun's articles, adding their own amazed commentary. A group of academics from Yale University traveled to New York, desperately trying to find the original Edinburgh Journal of Science supplement, which, of course, did not exist. The whole thing was a complete fabrication, written by a reporter at the Sun named Richard Adams Locke. He had masterfully blended real scientific facts. Sir John Herschel really was in South Africa with a new telescope, with a wild, imaginative narrative worthy of Jules Verne. So how did it end? It didn't end with a grand confession. The story just fizzled out. The final article claimed that the magnificent telescope had accidentally been pointed at the sun, and the lens, acting as a giant magnifying glass, had caught the observatory on fire, destroying the instrument and bringing the observations to an untimely end. Eventually, word came from the real Sir John Herschel in South Africa, who was completely baffled by the news reports and the insane story that had been attributed to him. By then, it didn't matter. The New York Sun never issued a retraction. They had sold their papers, and the public had enjoyed the show. The Great Moon Hoax was a lie that pretended to be science. But our next story is a lie that pretended to be a person. A tragic, troubled, and brilliant young author who became the voice of a generation, but who never, ever existed. Story number 20. The boy author who broke America's heart and never existed. Let's go to the 1990s. The cultural landscape is full of angst and authenticity. It's the era of grunge music, of confessional talk shows, of a fascination with stories of trauma and survival. And into this world comes a new literary voice, a voice so raw, so powerful, and so utterly heartbreaking that it becomes an instant sensation. The voice belongs to a young man named J.T. Leroy. His backstory was the stuff of tragic legend. According to his official biography, he was the son of a lot lizard, a prostitute who worked the truck stops of West Virginia. He had been abandoned, abused, and forced into prostitution himself at a young age. He was a homeless, drug-addicted, gender-fluid teenager who who had been rescued from the streets of San Francisco and encouraged to write down his experiences as a form of therapy. And the writing was electric. His first book, Sarah, published in 2000, was a surreal, dreamlike novel about a boy who takes on his mother's identity as a truck stop prostitute. It was praised by critics for its unique voice and brutal honesty. He followed it up with a collection of short stories, The Heart is Deceitful Above All Things. The literary world was captivated. J.T. Leroy was hailed as a prodigy, a modern-day Jean Genet, a survivor who had turned unimaginable pain into transcendent art. A cult of celebrity grew around him. Famous writers and rock stars championed his work. Gus Van Sant made a film based on one of his stories. Bono, Tom Waits, and Courtney Love were all counted among his friends and admirers. But JT was elusive. He rarely gave interviews. He never appeared on television. When he did appear in public, at readings or parties, he was a shy, almost spectral figure. He wore a cheap blonde wig, large sunglasses, and spoke in a whispered, barely audible voice. He was always accompanied by his friend and protector, a woman named Laura Albert. People accepted his strange behavior as a symptom of his profound trauma. Of course he was shy. Of course he was reclusive. Look at what he'd been through. The truth was far, far stranger. J.T. Leroy did not exist. The person under the wig and sunglasses was not a troubled boy. It was a woman named Savannah Knoop, the sister of Laura Albert's boyfriend. And the real author, the person who had written every word of J.T. Leroy's celebrated books, was the woman standing next to him all along, Laura Albert. Laura Albert was a woman in her 40s from Brooklyn who had her own history of trauma and had spent time on phone crisis hotlines. She had created J.T. Leroy as a writing avatar, a vessel through which she could tell the stories she wanted to tell. She would write the books, and then, speaking in a high-pitched, boyish voice, she would conduct interviews with journalists over the phone. When the pressure for J.T. to make a public appearance became too great, she convinced her sister-in-law, Savannah Knoop, to put on the costume and play the part. For 6 years, they maintained this elaborate, multi-layered deception. It was a literary performance piece. The shy boy in the wig, the protective friend, the tragic backstory. It was all part of the narrative. The lie finally unraveled in 2005. A journalist for New York Magazine grew suspicious and began to dig. He found the connections. He exposed the truth. The literary world was thrown into an uproar. Were the books still great works of art? Or were they worthless because the story behind them was a lie? Was Laura Albert a con artist who had cynically exploited a culture's obsession with victimhood? Or was she a brilliant writer who had created one of the most complex literary personas of all time? The J.T. Leroy affair was a lie about identity. It was a deception that asked difficult questions about what we value more, the art itself, or the perceived authenticity of the artist who creates it. It was a story built on words. But our next story is about a lie that built something even more lasting. It's about a man who claimed to have found a set of ancient golden plates, and whose story became the foundation of a brand new, uniquely American religion. Story number 21. The golden plates that no one else was allowed to see. The year is 1823. We're in upstate New York, in a region so swept by waves of religious enthusiasm, it was known as the Burned-Over District. This was the American frontier, a place where the old traditions of Europe were far away and anything felt possible. And in this landscape of spiritual seeking lived a young, charismatic, and largely uneducated man named Joseph Smith. Smith came from a poor farming family. He was, by his own account, confused by the competing claims of all the different Christian denominations. He prayed for guidance, and then, he said, something incredible happened. An angel named Moroni appeared to him in a vision. The angel told him a fantastic story, a story of an ancient civilization that had lived in the Americas centuries ago. These people, the angel explained, were descendants of the Israelites who had sailed to the New World. They had their own prophets, their own kings, and their own sacred history, which chronicled the visit of Jesus Christ to the Americas after his resurrection. This entire history, the angel said, had been recorded on a set of thin, golden plates, which were now buried in a nearby hill. For 4 years, Smith said, the angel visited him, preparing him for his great task. Finally, in 1827, Moroni led him to the spot. Smith unearthed a stone box, and inside were the golden plates, along with 2 magical seer stones, the Urim and Thummim, which would allow him to translate them. This is the core of the story, and here is the core of the problem. Joseph Smith was the only person allowed to see the golden plates. He claimed the angel had forbidden him from showing them to anyone else, on pain of death. He began the work of translation. He would sit behind a curtain, with the plates hidden from view, and dictate the text to a scribe. The words he dictated were the story of the Nephites and the Lamanites, the warring tribes of ancient America. It was a sprawling, epic narrative, written in a style that mimicked the King James Bible. This text would become the Book of Mormon. Now, from a skeptical point of view, this is a classic con man setup. He has a miraculous object that is the source of his divine authority, but conveniently, no one else is allowed to verify its existence. He has a secret, magical method for producing his text that cannot be scrutinized. And yet, people believed him. They were drawn to his charisma and to the power of the story he was telling. It was a uniquely American story. It gave the New World its own sacred history, its own Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden of the American continent. Eventually, Smith knew he needed witnesses. He gathered a small group of his most trusted followers. He led them into the woods to pray. And there, he claimed, the angel Moroni appeared to them and showed them the plates. 3 men, known as the 3 witnesses, signed a statement testifying that they had seen the plates and that they were of divine origin. A few days later, a group of 8 other men were allowed to see and handle the plates. Their testimony was also recorded. And then, after the translation was complete, Joseph Smith said the angel Moroni came one last time, took the golden plates back, and returned them to heaven. They were gone, forever. The only proof of their existence was the translated manuscript and the testimony of a handful of true believers. The publication of the Book of Mormon in 1830 was the birth of a new religion, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church. For believers, Joseph Smith is a prophet, and the story of the golden plates is a sacred miracle. For non-believers, he was a brilliant and charismatic fraud who wrote the book himself, likely drawing on other contemporary theories about the Hebraic origins of Native Americans, and then invented the story of the plates to give his work a divine seal of approval. What is undeniable is the power of the story. Whether a lie or a revelation, it was a narrative so compelling that it launched one of the most successful and enduring new religions in modern history. Joseph Smith's lie, or miracle, was about creating a new Holy Land in a new country. But our next story is about a con man who took that idea one step further. He didn't just write about a new country, he invented one, sold off pieces of it to wealthy investors, and then sent colonists to die in a swampy jungle that he had promised was a tropical paradise. Story number 22, The Prince of a Land That Never Was. London, the 1820s. The London Stock Exchange is a feverish cauldron of speculation. The Spanish Empire in the Americas has crumbled, and a host of new independent republics have emerged. Investors, eager for the next big thing, are pouring money into South American bonds and land grants. The continent is a canvas onto which they can project their wildest dreams of wealth and opportunity. Into this fevered atmosphere steps a man named Gregor McGregor. And what a man he was. Tall, handsome, decorated with medals from the Venezuelan War of Independence. He was a genuine war hero. But he wasn't content with that. He gave himself a new title, His Serene Highness, Gregor I, Prince of Poyais. Poyais, he explained, was a prosperous, thriving young nation on the Mosquito Coast of what is now Honduras. He claimed the native king had granted him sovereignty over a vast, fertile territory.
He described it in breathtaking detail. The capital city, St. Joseph, had a grand opera house, a cathedral, and colonnaded public buildings. The rivers were full of gold nuggets. The soil was so fertile you could harvest 3 crops of maize a year. The natives were friendly and eager to embrace European culture. It was a paradise on earth, just waiting for British know-how and investment to unlock its full potential. And MacGregor had the props. He produced a detailed map of the country, showing its rivers and towns. He had a flag designed. He had land grants printed on elaborate stationery. He even had an official Poyasian guidebook published, full of beautiful engravings of the fictional capital city. He opened a Poyasian legation, an embassy, in London. He gave interviews to newspapers, describing the boundless opportunities in his wonderful country. People fell for it completely. The story was too detailed, too compelling to be false. And MacGregor himself was so convincing. He wasn't just selling land, he was selling a dream. He began selling Poyasian government bonds in the London Stock Exchange, raising the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in today's money. Wealthy investors and aspiring colonists bought land grants. People even exchanged their British pounds for beautifully printed but utterly worthless Poyasian dollars. In 1822, the first ship of colonists set sail for paradise. 7 ships in total would follow, carrying about 250 hopeful settlers who had invested their life savings in the Poyasian dream. They arrived in the Mosquito Coast after a long and difficult voyage, and they found nothing. There was no St. Joseph. There was no opera house. There was no cathedral. There was only a dense, malarial, snake-infested jungle, an impenetrable swamp. They had been sent to one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. They had been utterly and completely deceived. Most of them died. They succumbed to yellow fever, to malaria, to starvation. By the time a rescue ship found the few desperate survivors, more than 180 people were dead. And what of His Serene Highness, Gregor MacGregor? By the time the news of the disaster reached London, he was long gone. He had taken the money and fled to France, where he immediately tried to run the exact same scam on French investors. For the rest of his life, he was a fugitive, a charlatan who lived in a fantasy world of his own creation. His lie wasn't just a financial fraud, it was a lethal one. He had invented a country, and in doing so, had signed the death warrants of hundreds of his own followers. MacGregor's lie was about a phantom country. But our next story is about a phantom of a different kind, a giant. A creature from a lost time, a petrified man of biblical proportions who was discovered, buried in the soil of upstate New York, and became the biggest tourist attraction in America. Story number 23, the 10-foot man who was born in a quarry. The year is 1869. We're in Cardiff, New York, a small farming community. The air is thick with religious debate. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species had been published 10 years earlier, shaking the foundations of faith. But many people still held a deep, literal belief in the Bible. And the Bible, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, says, "There were giants in the earth in those days." One of the staunchest believers in that verse was a man named George Hull. Hull was a cigar maker from Binghamton, New York, and a devout atheist, and he absolutely hated religious hypocrisy. He got into a furious argument with a Methodist preacher who insisted that the biblical giants were real and that their petrified bodies were just waiting to be discovered. An idea sparked in Hull's mind, a mischievous, elaborate, and brilliant idea. If these people wanted a giant, he would give them one. He began his great project in secret. He traveled to Iowa and hired a German stonecutter, instructing him to quarry the largest single block of gypsum he could find. Then, he told the stonecutter to carve it into the shape of a colossal, 10-foot-tall, naked man. He had the carver model the face after his own. To make the giant look ancient and weathered, Hull and his co-conspirators spent weeks pounding the statue with needles and darning hammers to simulate skin pores, and then washed it with sulfuric acid to give it an aged, pitted look.
The finished product was magnificent. A 10-foot, 3,000-pound petrified man. They secretly transported this giant by rail and wagon to the farm of his cousin, William Newell, in Cardiff. And there, in the dead of night, they buried him. A year passed. Then, in October of 1869, Newell coincidentally hired 2 men to dig a well for him. And they struck something. Something big. It was the body of the giant. The news exploded. This was it. The proof. An American Goliath. Scientists, scholars, clergymen, and thousands upon thousands of ordinary people flocked to the small farm in Cardiff. Newell put a tent over the excavation site and started charging admission. Money poured in. The Cardiff giant became the biggest tourist attraction in the country. Clergymen declared it a vindication of the Bible's truth. Scientists debated its origins. Was it an ancient statue or a genuine, petrified man? One Yale paleontologist, though he correctly identified it as a statue, was so convinced of its antiquity that he declared it the most remarkable object yet brought to light in this country. Hull, seeing the success, sold his share in the giant to a syndicate of businessmen for a huge profit. The new owners moved the giant to Syracuse, where it drew even bigger crowds. The legendary showman P.T. Barnum saw his chance. He offered the owners a fortune to lease the giant for his museum. When they refused, Barnum, in a move of pure, shameless genius, simply hired an artist to create his own exact replica of the giant. He then put his fake giant on display in New York City, declaring that his was the genuine article and the one in Syracuse was the fake. People lined up to see both. The truth, of course, was that they were both fake. The original deception began to crumble. Geologists pointed out that you can't petrify a gypsum statue. The quarrymen in Iowa started talking. The railroad workers remembered shipping a very large, very suspicious crate. Finally, cornered by journalists and scientists, George Hull, the atheist cigar maker, confessed everything. He gleefully told the world how he had created the giant specifically to make fools of the religious fundamentalists he despised. But here's the funny part. Even after the confession, people didn't care. They kept paying to see the giant. The story was just too good. The Cardiff giant was a lie, but it was a magnificent, entertaining lie. It was a joke played on the American public, and the public, it turned out, loved being in on the joke. The Cardiff giant was a deception designed to fool the believers in the supernatural. But our next story is about a lie that did the opposite. It was a deception that managed to fool one of the most famous rationalists in the world, the creator of Sherlock Holmes himself, into believing in the one thing his great detective would have instantly dismissed: fairies. Story number 24. The paper fairies that fooled the creator of Sherlock Holmes. The year is 1917. We're in the small village of Cottingley in Yorkshire, England. The Great War is raging across the Channel, a shadow of death and loss hanging over every family. In a quiet garden behind a small house, 2 young girls are playing. Elsie Wright is 16, and her cousin, Frances Griffiths, is 9. They often play down by the beck, the little stream at the bottom of the garden. And when they come back with muddy shoes and wet dresses, they tell their parents the same thing. "We've been playing with the fairies." The adults, of course, don't believe them. Elsie's father, in particular, is tired of hearing these fanciful stories. To prove their case, Elsie, who had a part-time job in a photographer's studio and knew her way around a camera, borrowed her father's plate camera. The 2 girls went down to the beck. An hour later, they returned, triumphant. Elsie developed the photographic plate in a makeshift darkroom. And there it was, a photograph of 9-year-old Frances, leaning on a bank of ferns, looking calmly at the camera. And in front of her, dancing on the foliage, were 4 small winged fairies. The photograph was incredible. A few months later, they produced a second one. This time, it showed Elsie sitting on the lawn, reaching out her hand to a tiny winged gnome who was hopping towards her. The images were charming, whimsical, and seemed utterly impossible. Their parents were stunned, but still skeptical. The photographs were put away and largely forgotten. But the story didn't end there. 3 years later, Elsie's mother attended a lecture on fairy life at the local Theosophical Society. Theosophy was a popular spiritualist movement at the time, dedicated to exploring ancient wisdom and mystical phenomena. After the lecture, she mentioned the photographs her daughter had taken. The Theosophists were electrified. This was the proof they had been looking for. The photographs were sent to the movement's leader, Edward Gardner. He, in turn, sent them to a photographic expert, who declared that the negatives showed no signs of being double exposed or tampered with. They were, he concluded, entirely genuine. And then, the story reached the one man whose endorsement would make it world famous, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the ultimate rationalist, Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was a brilliant man, but in his later years, following the death of his son in the war, he had become a passionate believer in spiritualism and the paranormal. He saw the fairy photographs not with the skeptical eye of his great detective, but with the hopeful heart of a true believer. This was it, the proof that there was more to the world than cold, hard reason. He wrote a sensational article for the Strand magazine in 1920 titled "Fairies Photographed, an Epoch-Making Event." He published the first 2 photos and defended their authenticity with all the weight of his considerable fame. The world went mad. Some people were enchanted, believing it was a sign of a new spiritual age. Others scoffed, convinced it was a childish prank. Conan Doyle, determined to prove the skeptics wrong, sent the girls 2 brand-new, top-of-the-line cameras and more photographic plates, asking them to try and capture more images. The girls, now caught in a lie that had spiraled far beyond their control, went back to the Beck and dutifully produced 3 more photographs, even more spectacular than the first. Conan Doyle published these as well, declaring the case for the existence of fairies to be overwhelmingly strong. So how did 2 young girls in a garden pull it off? The secret was embarrassingly simple. The fairies were paper cutouts. Elsie, a talented artist, had copied illustrations from a popular children's book of the time, Princess Mary's Gift Book. She drew her own fairies, added wings, and cut them out. They then propped up these paper figures in the foliage with hat pins and took their photographs. That's it. It was a simple, charming prank that they had never intended for anyone outside their own family to see. It wasn't until the early 1980s, when both Elsie and Frances were elderly women, that they finally confessed the whole truth. They admitted that 4 of the 5 photos were fakes. But, in a strange final twist to the story, Frances, the younger cousin, insisted to her dying day that the 5th and final photograph, the one showing fairies sunbathing in a cocoon of light, was actually real. The Cottingley Fairies story is a perfect little fable. A story about how, in a world racked by war and suffering, people, even the most brilliant and rational among them, were so desperate to believe in a little bit of magic that they were willing to overlook the obvious. The Cottingley Fairies were a harmless, whimsical lie. But our next story takes us from the garden to the birthing room, for a deception so bizarre and so grotesque, it sounds like something from a horror film. It's the story of a woman who convinced the king's own doctors that she was giving birth to rabbits. Story number 25, The Woman Who Gave Birth to Dead Rabbits. The year is 1726. We're in the town of Godalming in Surrey, England. A local peasant woman named Mary Toft, who is illiterate and poor, has just suffered a miscarriage. A few weeks later, a strange and disturbing rumor begins to spread. Mary Toft is giving birth again, but not to a child. She is giving birth to animal parts. A local surgeon, John Howard, is called to investigate. He is a man of some standing, a respected man midwife. He arrives at the Toft house and, to his utter astonishment, witnesses Mary, who is in the throes of what appear to be labor pains, deliver a cat's leg, and then another, and then the body of a rabbit. Over the next few weeks, Howard delivers a steady stream of dead rabbits and rabbit parts from Mary Toft. Howard is baffled, but he is a believer. He begins sending letters to the most prominent doctors and scientists in London, even to the court of King George I. He has witnessed a miracle of nature, a monstrous birth that defies all explanation. The story becomes a national sensation. The king is fascinated, and dispatches two of his most trusted men to investigate: Nathaniel St. Andre, the royal surgeon and anatomist, and Samuel Molyneux, the Prince of Wales's secretary. They travel to Godalming, and they too witness the miracle. St. Andre personally examines Mary and helps deliver the torso of a rabbit. He is completely convinced. He dissects the animal parts, and in a moment of stunning scientific incompetence, declares that the creatures could not have been placed inside her from the outside. He concludes they must have developed in her fallopian tubes. St. Andre rushes back to London and publishes a pamphlet titled A Short Narrative of an Extraordinary Delivery of Rabbits. He has staked his entire professional reputation on the authenticity of Mary Toft's monstrous births. Mary is brought to London for further study, a national celebrity. She is put on display, and for a short time, she continues to produce the occasional rabbit part, all while being watched by the most eminent physicians in the country. But doubts begin to creep in. A suspicious porter at the London guest house is caught trying to sneak a small rabbit into Mary Toft's room. He confesses that Mary's sister-in-law had asked him to procure the smallest rabbit he could find. More damningly, a few doctors with a better understanding of biology examine the birthed rabbit parts and notice something St. Andre had missed. They find straw and corn, undigested food, in the rabbit's stomachs. Food they could only have eaten before being inserted into Mary Toft's body. The hoax was unraveling. Under intense questioning and the threat of a painful and dangerous operation to examine her womb, Mary Toft finally broke down. She confessed everything. The truth was a crude and desperate trick. After her miscarriage, she had been fascinated by a neighbor's rabbit hopping in a field. The idea for the hoax was born. An accomplice would supply her with dead kittens and rabbits. She had learned how to manually insert the animal parts into her body, and then, through sheer muscular control, simulate the contractions of labor and expel them, fooling the doctors who were examining her. It was a painful, gruesome, and incredibly risky deception. The public humiliation was immediate and total. The medical profession became a national laughingstock. Satirical cartoons and poems flooded the streets of London, mocking the gullible doctors. Nathaniel St. Andre, the king's surgeon who had so publicly championed her, saw his glittering career destroyed overnight. Mary Toft was briefly imprisoned for fraud, and then sent home in disgrace. A footnote in the annals of the bazaar. Her lie was a grotesque piece of body horror theater, a deception that exposed the shocking limits of medical knowledge in the Age of Enlightenment. It was a lie performed with flesh and blood. But our next story is a lie performed with paint and canvas, a deception so masterful that its creator had to prove he was a forger in order to save his own life. Story number 26. The Forger Who Fooled the Nazis with a Fake Vermeer. The time is 1945. The Second World War has just ended. Europe is in ruins, and the Allied forces are engaged in a massive treasure hunt, trying to recover the countless masterpieces of art that were looted by the Nazis. In Amsterdam, they track a magnificent, previously unknown painting by the Dutch master Johannes Vermeer, titled The Woman Taken in Adultery, to a surprising owner: the infamous Nazi second-in-command, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. Selling a Dutch national treasure to the enemy, especially to a monster like Göring, was an act of treason, a capital crime. The trail for the sale of the painting leads the authorities to a man named Han van Meegeren. Van Meegeren was a moderately successful artist, known for his traditional style and his public hatred of the modern art world and its critics, who he felt had unfairly dismissed his work. He was arrested and charged with collaboration. The evidence was overwhelming. He had sold the Vermeer. The punishment was clear. He faced a long prison sentence, or possibly even execution. Facing this grim reality, Han van Meegeren offered a defense that was so audacious, so utterly unbelievable, that the prosecutors laughed in his face. He claimed that the painting he sold to Hermann Göring was not a real Vermeer. He claimed that he, Han van Meegeren, had painted it himself. The authorities were incredulous. The painting had been examined by the world's leading Vermeer experts. They had authenticated it without hesitation, hailing it as perhaps the finest Vermeer they had ever seen. The idea that this washed-up second-rate artist could have created it was preposterous. Van Meegeren insisted. He wasn't a traitor, he said. He was a forger. And he hadn't just faked that one painting. He had faked many others.
For years, he explained, he had been locked in a secret war with the art critics he despised. He wanted to prove that they were arrogant fools who couldn't tell a real masterpiece from a clever fake. So he had dedicated himself to becoming Vermeer. He researched the 17th century master's techniques with obsessive detail. He found old canvases from the period. He learned how to grind and mix his pigments using the same methods Vermeer had used. His masterstroke was figuring out how to fake the 300-year-old craquelure, the fine network of cracks in the paint. He mixed his pigments with a synthetic resin, bakelite, and then baked the finished canvas in an oven. The process hardened the paint and created a perfect, aged, cracked surface that was indistinguishable from the real thing. His first great forgery, The Supper at Emmaus, was hailed by the critics as Vermeer's most beautiful work. He had done it. He had fooled them all. And he had made a fortune in the process.
But now, in a prison cell, no one believed him. His lie was too good. He had to prove he was a forger to save his own life. The court, as a final test, agreed to his request. They provided him with a canvas, pigments, and a guard. And there, in front of journalists and court officials, Han van Meegeren painted his final masterpiece, a brand new, undiscovered Johannes Vermeer. The proof was undeniable. He had done it. The charges of collaboration were dropped. Overnight, Han van Meegeren went from being a reviled traitor to a beloved national hero. He was a folk hero, the clever Dutchman who had not only fooled the arrogant art critics, but had swindled the most hated of Nazi leaders, Hermann Göring himself, with a fake. He was tried and convicted on the lesser charge of forgery and sentenced to a single year in prison. But he died of a heart attack before he could serve his time, a legend in the world of art crime. Van Meegeren's deception was a lie about the past, a forgery designed to rewrite art history. But our next story is about a writer who tried to pull off a similar trick, a lie about the present. He claimed to have landed the most exclusive interview of the century, the autobiography of a man so reclusive and so eccentric he was practically a ghost. A man named Howard Hughes. Story number 27, The Billionaire Ghost and the Book That Was Never Written. The year is 1970. Howard Hughes is less a man and more a myth. He is one of the richest people in the world, an aviator, a movie mogul, an industrialist, but he has also become the world's most famous recluse. For over a decade, no one has seen him. He lives in a self-imposed prison on the top floor of a Las Vegas hotel, surrounded by a handful of aides, terrified of germs, his body wasting away, his mind lost in the grip of obsessive-compulsive disorder. He is a ghost, a phantom, and everyone wants to know his story. Enter Clifford Irving. Irving was a novelist of moderate success. He was ambitious, charming, and hungry for a big break, and he came up with a plan so daring it was almost insane. He would write the most sought-after book on the planet, the authorized autobiography of Howard Hughes. The only problem was, he had never met, spoken to, or had any contact with Howard Hughes whatsoever. He began his con with a simple forgery. He studied examples of Hughes's handwriting and wrote a few short, convincing letters, supposedly from Hughes to himself. In these letters, the reclusive billionaire expressed admiration for one of Irving's previous books and cautiously proposed a secret collaboration on his life story. Irving took these forged letters to his publisher, McGraw-Hill. The editors were stunned. The literary world had been trying to get to Hughes for years, and this mid-list novelist had succeeded? It seemed incredible. But the letters, when examined by handwriting experts, looked authentic. The publishers, blinded by the sheer magnitude of the potential bestseller, took the bait. They gave Irving a massive advance, over $500,000, which was to be paid in checks made out to H.R. Hughes.
The lie was now in motion. Irving's wife helped him by opening a Swiss bank account under the name Helga R. Hughes, allowing them to deposit the checks. The Great Deception had begun. For the next year, Clifford Irving lived a fantasy life. He told his publishers he was engaged in a series of clandestine meetings with the great man himself, in secret locations across the Americas, in Mexico, in the Bahamas, on a dusty roadside in the Nevada desert. Of course, these were all just elaborate vacations funded by the publisher's advance. But how did he write the book? How could he possibly know the details of Hughes's life? He got lucky. A writer who had been ghostwriting a memoir for one of Hughes's former top aides gave Irving a draft of the unpublished manuscript. It was a treasure trove of personal anecdotes, business details, and quirky habits. It was the raw material he needed. Irving, a skilled writer, took this material and wove it into a compelling first-person narrative, perfectly capturing Hughes's eccentric and paranoid voice. He recorded hours of fake interviews with himself, imitating Hughes's Texas drawl. The manuscript was delivered. The publishers were ecstatic. It was brilliant. It was authentic. They announced the book's publication as the literary event of the century. Time magazine and Life magazine bought the serialization rights. Everything was set for a massive success. And then, the ghost spoke. From his penthouse prison in the Bahamas, Howard Hughes, for the first time in 14 years, decided to break his silence. He was furious. He assembled a group of journalists who knew him from his old Hollywood days, and, via a telephone conference call, with his frail, reedy voice being broadcast to the world, he denounced Clifford Irving. He called him a fraud. He said he'd never met him, never spoken to him, and had certainly never authorized an autobiography. "This Irving," he famously said, "is a completely unknown man to me." The lie collapsed instantly and spectacularly. It was a global media sensation. Clifford Irving's house of cards came tumbling down. The Swiss bank account was discovered. The forgeries were exposed. He and his wife were arrested, tried, and sent to prison. Irving's deception was a lie about access, a claim to have captured the voice of a man no one could reach. But our next story is about a lie where the voices were all too real. It's about a musical duo who reached the absolute pinnacle of fame, until a skipping record revealed that the voices the world loved were not their own. Story number 28. The pop stars who didn't sing a single note. The year is 1989. The world of pop music is dominated by synthesizers, big hair, and music videos. And the hottest new act on the planet is a duo from Germany called Milli Vanilli. They were the total package. Two impossibly handsome young men, Fabrice Morvan and Rob Pilatus, with long dreadlocks, chiseled features, and incredible dance moves. Their debut album, Girl You Know It's True, was a monster hit. It sold millions of copies and spawned a string of #1 singles. Blame It on the Rain, Baby Don't Forget My Number, Girl I'm Gonna Miss You. The songs were everywhere. They were the sound of the late 80s. Rob and Fab were global superstars, adored by millions of fans for their soulful, accented vocals and charismatic performances. In 1990, they reached the absolute peak. They won the Grammy Award for Best New Artist. Standing on that stage, holding that golden gramophone, they were on top of the world, the living embodiment of the pop music dream. And the entire thing was a lie, a complete and total fabrication. The whisper of doubt had been there from the start. Some critics noted that their English seemed much weaker in interviews than it did in their songs. But the machine of their success was too powerful. No one wanted to believe it. Until one night, during a live performance for MTV in Connecticut. They were in the middle of their hit song, Girl You Know It's True. They were dancing, lip-syncing, and the crowd was going wild. And then it happened. The backing track, the pre-recorded tape they were performing to, began to skip. The line, Girl You Know It's True, began to repeat over and over and over. Girl, you know it's... Girl, you know it's... Girl, you know it's... For a moment, Rob and Fab froze in panic. They had no idea what to do. The illusion was shattered.
They ran off the stage in humiliation. The audience was confused, but the secret was out. It was the beginning of the end. The truth was this. Rob and Fab, the beautiful faces of Milli Vanilli, had not sung a single note on their multi-platinum album. They were models, dancers. They had been discovered in a German nightclub by a cynical and brilliant record producer named Frank Farian. Farian had already recorded the songs with a group of talented but, in his view, unmarketable studio singers. He needed faces to sell the music. He hired Rob and Fab for their looks and their charisma, and he made them an offer. Lip sync to the tracks, and I will make you superstars. They agreed. After the disastrous MTV concert, the pressure mounted. Rob and Fab, tired of living the lie and wanting to sing for real, demanded that Farian let them record their own album. Farian refused, and in a preemptive strike, he called a press conference and confessed everything. He told the world that his two stars were frauds. The public backlash was swift and brutal. They were a joke, a symbol of everything fake and manufactured in the music industry. Their Grammy Award was revoked, the first time that had ever happened in the award's history. They were sued by fans. Their careers were utterly destroyed. The lie was so big that the truth, when it came out, left no survivors. It was a spectacular fall from grace, a pop music tragedy played out on a global stage, all because of a skipping record that revealed the voices belonged to someone else. The Milli Vanilli story was a lie about talent. But our next story is about a lie of a different kind. It's not about faking a skill you don't have. It's about faking an achievement. A story of a woman who won one of the most prestigious athletic events in the world. Not through endurance, but through a shortcut on the subway. Story number 29. The marathon champion who took the subway. The year is 1980. The city is Boston, and it's the third Monday in April, which means it's time for the Boston Marathon. It is the oldest and perhaps the most prestigious marathon in the world. Thousands of runners from all over the globe gather to test their limits on the punishing 26.2-mile course. Among the competitors that day was a woman from New York named Rosie Ruiz. She was an unknown in the world of elite running. She had supposedly qualified for Boston by running the New York City Marathon just 6 months earlier in a very impressive time. Now, she was here to compete against the best. The race began. The top female runners, women who had trained their entire lives for this moment, set a blistering pace. For over 2 hours, they battled each other through the famously difficult Boston course, up Heartbreak Hill and towards the finish line on Boylston Street. And then, something strange happened. As the race entered its final mile, a woman wearing bib number W50, Rosie Ruiz, suddenly appeared in the lead pack. No one had seen her for the first 25 miles. The other runners didn't recognize her. The race officials and spotters along the course had no record of her passing the checkpoints. But there she was, sprinting towards the finish. She crossed the line with a time of 2 hours, 31 minutes, and 56 seconds. It wasn't just a victory. It was the third fastest time ever recorded by a female marathoner in history. She was crowned the winner of the Boston Marathon. She was given the traditional olive wreath and the winner's medal. She stood on the podium, beaming, telling reporters that her secret was waking up every morning and thinking, "I'm going to win." But the story almost immediately began to fall apart. The real female runners, the ones who had been in the lead for the entire race, were baffled. They knew they had been in front. They knew this woman had not passed them. Bill Rogers, the winner of the men's race that day, was suspicious. He noticed that Ruiz didn't seem to be sweating. Her running clothes were dry, and she didn't look like someone who had just run for 2.5 hours. The questions started. Journalists began digging. They asked her about her race strategy, about her split times. She had no answers. She couldn't remember her intervals. When asked what Heartbreak Hill was, the most famous and punishing part of the course, she had no idea. Then, 2 students who had been watching the race from the crowd came forward. They remembered seeing her. They had seen Rosie Ruiz burst out of the crowd of spectators on Commonwealth Avenue, about a mile from the finish line, and simply start running. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when another witness reported seeing a woman matching her description, wearing running gear, riding the Boston subway during the race. Her previous qualifying run at the New York City Marathon was also investigated. It turned out she had done the exact same thing there, riding the subway and rejoining the race near the finish. The deception was as simple as it was shameless. She had not run the marathon. She had simply found a way to get to the finish line first. 8 days after her supposed victory, Rosie Ruiz was officially disqualified. The rightful winner, a Canadian woman named Jacqueline Garreau, was flown back to Boston and awarded the medal she had earned. Rosie Ruiz became a household name, but not as a champion. She became a symbol of cheating, a punchline for a joke about taking a shortcut to success. Rosie's lie was a simple, opportunistic fraud designed for personal glory. But our final story is about a lie that was far more complex and far more elegant. It was a prank. A piece of high society performance art, played not for fame or money, but for the sheer, unadulterated joy of making the most powerful institution in the British Empire look utterly and completely ridiculous. Story number 30. The day the Ethiopian princes inspected the British Navy. The year is 1910. The British Empire is at the zenith of its power. The sun, as they say, never sets on it. And the single most powerful and terrifying symbol of that power is the Royal Navy's new flagship, HMS Dreadnought. She was a revolutionary battleship, so advanced and so heavily armed that she had made every other warship in the world instantly obsolete. She was the floating embodiment of British might, a fortress of steel and imperial pride. In this world of stiff upper lips and rigid social protocol lived a group of friends who were the polar opposite of the establishment. They were the Bloomsbury Group, a circle of young bohemian artists, writers, and intellectuals. Among them was a mischievous young poet named Horace de Vere Cole and a future literary giant, Virginia Woolf. They were clever, witty, and possessed a deep and abiding contempt for authority. Cole, the ringleader, decided that the pompous and self-important Royal Navy was a target too tempting to resist. He devised a plan of exquisite simplicity and audacity. He would arrange for an official state visit to HMS Dreadnought by a delegation of Abyssinian, Ethiopian, princes. The prank began with a forged telegram. Cole had a friend send a message to the naval base where the Dreadnought was anchored. The telegram was allegedly from the Foreign Office in London. It informed the admiral that a group of princes from Abyssinia would be arriving that afternoon and requested that they be given a full VIP tour of the flagship. The Navy, ever mindful of protocol and the importance of imperial diplomacy, immediately began to scramble. They ordered a full honor guard, a marching band, and rolled out the red carpet. Meanwhile, in London, Cole and his co-conspirators were getting into costume. The group, which included Virginia Woolf and several of her male friends, rented theatrical costumes and darkened their skin with grease paint. They put on fake beards and magnificent turbans. Cole appointed himself the interpreter. They hired a fancy car and made their way to Paddington Station, where they were met, as arranged, by a representative of the real Foreign Office, who had been tricked by a separate phone call and escorted them to their private train to the coast. When the royal delegation arrived at the naval base, they were met with the highest honors. The admiral, the captain, and a line of smartly dressed officers were all there to greet them. The band played, the honor guard snapped to attention, the tour began. The Abyssinians, speaking only in a theatrical gibberish made up of vaguely Latin-sounding phrases and snippets from Virgil, walked the decks of the mighty warship. Cole, as the interpreter, would translate their exclamations of wonder. At every new piece of naval technology, the princes would cry out, "Bunga, bunga!" Cole would gravely inform the officers that this was the Abyssinian for "how impressive." The deception was almost perfect. The officers, completely blinded by the official telegram and the sheer confidence of the performers, saw nothing amiss. They didn't notice that the royal flag the princes carried was a joke. They didn't notice that the prince's skin color was starting to run in the light rain. At one point, the admiral asked if the delegation would like to stay for lunch. Cole, thinking fast, knew that eating would almost certainly ruin their makeup. He politely declined, explaining that the prince's religious customs forbade them from eating any food not specially prepared by their own royal chef. After a thorough tour, the delegation departed with full honors. They took the train back to London, giddy with their success. They had done it. They had made a complete mockery of the most powerful navy in the world. The story, of course, leaked to the press. The nation was scandalized and, secretly, delighted. The Royal Navy was utterly humiliated. Bunga Bunga became a national catchphrase. The pranksters became legends. It was a perfect act of intellectual rebellion, a reminder that even the most powerful and pompous institutions can be brought low, not by force, but by a little bit of cleverness, a fake beard, and a good dose of theatrical absurdity. And so, the file closes. The 30th tale has been told. We have walked together through the echoing corridors of these archives, pulling files on lies that rewrote science, faith, and history. We've seen phantoms made of paper and ink, of light and shadow, of bone and plaster. We've met charlatans who sold kingdoms that never were, and pop stars who sold voices that were not their own. We've witnessed how greed can build an empire of air, and how a child's prank with paper fairies can capture the heart of a genius. Each of these 30 stories is a testament to the same strange and wonderful truth, that humanity is a creature of belief. We are wired to trust, to hope, and to see the patterns we wish to see. And in that space between desire and reality, the great deceptions are born. The archives are quiet again, the dust settles. But do not think for a moment that the stories have ended. They are endless. Every artifact in this place holds a secret, a lie, or a forgotten truth more fantastic than any fiction. The only question is, which file to open next? The choice, as always, is yours.